Welcome to Module 1, Part 2. So this is going to focus on Learning Objective 2, Methodologies. This second part of Module 1 will look at methods used in English language teaching. The methods date back to the 1840s with the grammar translation method and go through a range of methods and changes over time. The end of the module looks at a more modern day approach to language teaching, and the key word here is eclectic. Most teachers today use a variety of methods and approaches rather than just one. Let's look at some key language. It's useful to look at good teaching practice and how methods are used in the classroom today. So one method of teaching is a deductive approach. And this is a traditional approach to learning, where students learn the rules first and then apply them. The focus is on explanation, then practice. The opposite of deductive is inductive, and this is a more modern approach to learning, where language is presented in a real context and students discover the rules for themselves and practice the language. Another key word is realia, so the use of real-life objects and props to enhance the learning for our students. And drilling. So mechanical repetition when presenting a new word or structure is something you will see in this module. Drilling can be done in two ways. Choral drilling as a whole class, and then secondly, individual drilling. So let's just consider these words again. Deductive is about explain and practice. Inductive is discover and practice. Realia are props or real-life objects, and drilling is a form of repetition in the classroom. Let's look back on the theories of language learning. First, we have the naturalistic view. This is communication is the primary function of language, which should be acquired in stages. And this was the thought of Krashen. Then we have the mentalist view. Language acquisition is an innate process. And this was the view of Noam Chomsky. A cognitive view, language learning is a process using active mental processes rather than just forming habits. And this was the view of Piaget. Behaviourist view, a mechanical process of learning by heart and habit formation. And this was the view of Pavlov and Skinner. And then we have the humanistic view, looking at learning should engage the whole person, not just as a cognitive level, but with emotions and feelings. This was the view as Lázanov and Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Let's look back in history at methods over time. Methods evolve and change all the time. And if we look back to 1840, we can see how language teaching has changed in many ways. It's taken some parts from some methods, which today forms more of an eclectic method of teaching. So eclecticism, what is this and why is it useful? Eclectic is about using a mix of measures in the classroom. So why is this useful? In your classes, reflect on the learners you have in front of you. They will all be different in their learning styles, in their personalities and approaches. And often a more mixed approach can be more beneficial for the learners in your class. Let's look at the grammar translation method. So this started in 1840 and lasted until about 1940. It followed a deductive approach. So remember, deductive is about explaining and practicing. This method was based on rote learning and memorisation. It was a very formal approach to teaching that was very teacher-centred. There was no attention paid to individual learning needs and a huge emphasis on reading. So let's reflect. Nowadays, language teaching is more about a student-centred approach in the hope of encouraging learner autonomy. There is also a focus on learner engagement and motivation. And this could be quite tricky with the grammar translation approach because it was very teacher-centred and very formal. Always bear in mind that different methods and approaches will cater to different students and needs. So let's look further at the grammar translation. There was no focus on individual needs or learning preferences. It was very teacher-centred. A focus on reading. It was very formal and very structured. It followed a deductive approach to teaching, learning the rules. Quite passive learning for the students in the class, and no emphasis on speaking the target language or listening to it. It was very much based on the idea of rote learning, translation, and memorization. So if we explore this further and consider 21st century skills, which often involve learner autonomy and quite an inductive approach, we can see the grammar translation is quite different. So it's a very different approach from a more learner-centred approach today, which allows for more learner autonomy and is generally less formal. The second method to look at is the direct method. And this was a reaction to the outdated grammar translation method. The direct method came about in the earliest 20th century. It followed an inductive approach. Remember inductive? Discover and practice. The direct approach focused on languages being taught without the need for translation. The idea was that meaning can be communicated directly through pictures, miming, and realia. So if we think about the direct approach, we can look at pictures, miming, and realia. This is definitely something we've taken into modern day teaching. Visuals are really useful for learners. Miming can add clues to lower levels, and realia or props can be a great addition to any classroom. Let's look at the direct method in a bit more detail. There was a focus on spoken language and listening comprehension. You will find many students want to focus on these two particular skills. It was thought the meaning of language can be communicated through pictures, realia, and miming. There was a focus on the correct pronunciation and grammar, but grammar was taught inductively. The language could be taught without translation, so zero translation was used here. The teacher demonstrated and modelled through mime, visuals and realia, and the students learnt their grammar inductively. There are many relevant points to the direct method. Most classes today use visuals and realia to help with student engagement. Pronunciation should and is an integral part of any language learning, and it's important to integrate it into languages all the time. There is the point that language can be taught without translation. This was often referred to as full immersion language teaching. But we should also recognise that a learner's native language is a resource tool we can use to help them with language learning. Next came the audio-lingual method, and this came about in the 1950s, predominantly in the USA. Again, following an inductive approach, discover and practice. So the main philosophy behind the audio-lingual method was language is speech, not writing. The audio-lingual method was based on behaviourism, specifically classical behaviourism. The idea that classical conditioning in behaviourism can also be used in language teaching. Let's look further at the audio-lingual method. So this started in the 1950s in the USA, and the idea was language can be learned through practicing grammar and lexical, vocabulary patterns, through vigorous repetition until they're internalised. So there was a focus on form and pronunciation rather than communication, repetitive drills led by the teacher, no grammatical explanation, following quite an inductive method. And there was the use of visual aids and audio. So if we look at this in a bit more detail, form and pronunciation are two integral parts to language learning. We often talk about MFP, meaning, form, and pronunciation. So this is teaching the meaning, the pronunciation when students encounter a new word. Repetitive drills can be very teacher-centred and quite a demotivating approach for learners. whereas repetition, recycling and reviewing language is hugely important. But perhaps the idea of vigorous repetition sounds a bit scary. Of course, like everything we do as teachers in the classroom, we need to always consider the learners we have in front of them and what works best for them. In the 1970s, we had TPR, which is the Total Physical Response method. This was based following teacher instruction, so a real focus on repetition through mime and language. Very effective with young learners and beginner level learners. And actually, it's still used as an effective method in the classroom today. It can be really useful to use TPR when teaching vocabulary, phrases with actions, tenses such as the present continuous tense, I am talking, what am I doing, and also for classroom commands. If we look at the TPR, Total Physical Response, in more detail, it was first developed by James Asher in the 1970s, and there was a belief that actions can help with spoken language. It was a combination of listening and actions can help with spontaneous speech. Commands relied on physical response. There was no explicit grammar teaching, and there was a lot of movement. So very useful for kinesthetic learners or younger learners perhaps. So let's look at an example. The teacher introduces a command. Open your book. The teacher says the command and mimes the action. Open your book. The students and teacher together say the command and mime the action. Open your book. The teacher says the command, open your book, and the students do the action. And then you can reverse it. So with every method, we need to consider the pros and the cons. So with TPR, or Total Physical Response, the benefits: little preparation is needed from the teacher. It's quite easy to implement. There's an element of fun for the learners. It creates a safe learning environment as everyone is doing the same thing. It can really help with long-term retention of language. It's been proven in research that if we do something actively when learning language, we have a mental association that can help us remember. You can use it with small classes and large classes. It actually mimics the nature of native language acquisition and how we acquire our first language. Extremely useful for kinesthetic learners and can also help with listening skills. Perhaps the downside, as with every approach, there are limitations. And perhaps if it's overused, students may tire of it. And we could also say that maybe it limits individual creativity. If we move on to the silent way. So how does this work in the classroom? The teacher remains silent and only provides help when necessary. Students should have independence from the teacher. It was first introduced by Caleb Gettegno with the ideas that extensive silence is used as an actual teaching method. There is a focus on student participation and learner autonomy. And Caleb used the silence in order to achieve these two goals. Tell me and I forget. Teach me and I remember. Involve me and I learn. A quote by Benjamin Franklin. Focusing more on the silent way, learning was enhanced by using Cuisenaire rods. So what are Cuisenaire rods? They are different coloured wooden blocks that come in a range of sizes. And they were used with the silent method to add creativity. They were also used to create situations where students can discover rather than explicitly be taught something. They created a visual model for learners which can help provide a mental map to associate language with the Cuisenaire rods. Learners work collaboratively and the teacher observes silently while monitoring the interaction. They are often used to focus on word stress, word order, affixation, and prepositions. So let's have a look at an example. If we look at word stress, Sometimes we have primary stress, which comes at the front of the word, and secondary stress later on in the word. So we can have a small red block that indicates primary stress and a large blue block that indicates secondary stress. You can give the students a list of words and they have to put the Cuisenaire rods next to the corresponding words. Let's move on to Suggestopedia. Suggestopedia was based on using relaxation techniques in order to learn a new language. Sit back and let the language wash over you. Georgi Lazavnov was a Bulgarian doctor and also a psychotherapist. And he introduced the concept that students set up psychological barriers based on internal fears when learning. And this was very detrimental to the learning process and perhaps limited their learning ability. Suggestopedia was a reflection on how the human brain works, and Lazavnov came up with some key factors to produce more of a positive and relaxed learning environment. Music was an integral factor, using music in the classroom to create a more relaxed environment. Secondly, the classroom environment. There was a focus on the setup and the lighting to create the best environment for the learners. There was no focus on error correction, and this can often be demotivating if there's too much error correction for learners. And also the use of drama in the lesson. So there are elements of Suggestopedia that are still relevant to modern day language classes. A teacher should always focus on creating a safe and comfortable learning environment because this can help the learners. A key area to think about and pause is Maslow before Bloom's. There are many valid points to Suggestopedia. Maslow's hierarchy of needs refers to looking at the whole person, not just focusing on the cognitive needs, but focusing on every aspect. Then there is Bloom's taxonomy, which is a view of higher level thinking to integrate into learning objectives, a much more pedagogical focus. A phrase I've heard often recently is Maslow before Bloom, and this reflects back to Suggestopedia and the idea that social and physiological factors are just as important as cognitive factors. If we look at another approach called the lexical approach, and this was developed by Michael Lewis in 1993. And this was very much that language should be taught in multi-word prefabricated chunks rather than in isolation. This was the idea that fluency is the result of acquiring lexical items, such as collocations, based on exposure to them through reading, listening and highlighting. So when we think about collocation, we're talking about a big piece of language or a big chunk of language. And it's said that learning these bigger pieces of language is more beneficial than learning words in isolation. So this is a hugely popular approach, still very relevant today. Collocations or chunks of language occur naturally for native speakers, but not so much for non-native speakers. This is why you will often hear a non-native speaker talk about losing the bus instead of missing the bus, or making homework instead of doing homework. The idea is that by learning chunks of language, students will have one unit of language, rather than translating individual pieces that have no sense or meanings. Collocations can really help learners read better, speak better, listen better, and read better. If we look at the lexical approach in a bit more detail, it's a focus on lexis or vocabulary rather than grammar. Chunks, so big pieces of language. A focus on developing learners' language through these chunks of language. But massively important, vocabulary should be taught in a context. So how do we do that? Get students to notice and raise awareness in your classes of collocations of chunks of language. Get students to highlight and underline. Recording language patterns, and use a dictionary. In a dictionary, it will show you how many parts can collocate with a particular word. And in fact, you can find a specific dictionary just for collocations. This brings us to eclecticism. Eclecticism, perhaps better when you're catering for a range of learning styles in your class. Eclecticism is possibly the most common approach. It uses a mix of appropriate methods and techniques. And this is a more favoured approach nowadays because we're looking at teaching the learners, the individual learners. Let's look at behaviourism. So behaviourism is a belief that language is learned behaviour, and we learn through the imitation of modelling. So if we look at the example of classical behaviourism, this was learning is associated with a particular stimulus. The most famous example is Pavlov and his dogs. So if we look at Pavlov and his dogs with classical behaviourism, Pavlov noticed the dogs salivating in anticipation of food. He conditioned their behaviour by adding a stimulus of a bell. The bell was then linked to anticipation of food. Pavlov had conditioned this as the bell alone at first would provide no response. If we look at operant behaviourism, this is modifying behaviour through positive and negative reinforcement. Let's look at a typical example. I want the children to tidy up their desks. Positive reward, give them something. Incentivise, give a reward. Or negative reward, perhaps take something away. The opposite of the grammar translation method, audiolingualism, started in the USA in the 1950s. So this was a focus on grammatical and phonological structures through vigorous repetition and drilling. So as we stated before, drilling with a focus on language is speech and not writing. The natural way is a replica of how we acquire our first or native language. So language is acquired through stages. So think about as a baby. They start to make noises, they repeat short words, and then they increase through developmental stages. This can be mirrored in second language teaching as we acquire language in similar stages, learning words, then sentences, then more complex sentences and vocabulary. So the natural way, communication is the primary function of language, which should be acquired in stages, stated by Krashen and Terrell. If we focus our attention on the humanistic approach, this is learning should engage the whole person, including emotions and feelings, a real sense of caring and sharing in the classroom. The humanistic approach could also look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which looks at the whole person, not just cognitive needs. So if we look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it takes into account self-actualization, self-esteem, love and belonging, safety needs, and physiological needs. And it's often stated if we look at these before any cognitive needs, it's much more beneficial for our learners. Let's have a look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs in the classroom. So, is the child distressed? Is the child hungry? Does the child have a friendship group? Do they feel part of the group? Do they have motivation? So these are questions we can ask as teachers relating to our students to really take into account the whole being of the person, not just the cognitive needs. And as we know, if a child's distressed, it's not a conducive learning environment. If a child is hungry, they will find it very difficult to focus and concentrate. If a child is not part of a friendship group, they may really struggle at school. And again, if they don't feel part of the group or the class, they may struggle. Let's have a think and consider, how do we match all of these different types of methodologies to learners' needs? So we can often categorise learners into specific learning styles based on how they react to visuals, audio, realia, and hands-on activities in the classroom. It's really important to understand learning styles to help learners achieve their potential. Using a range of activities to cater for learning styles can build rapport in your classes, increase engagement, and help their overall performance. Let's focus our attention on visual learners. So what does it mean to be a visual learner? Visual learners retain information from seeing something. So how can we implement that into our classes? You can use handouts. You can write on the board. Think about perhaps colour codes and categorising on the board. Building visual vocabulary. Perhaps using emojis, mind maps or word clouds, or diagrams of some sort. Graphs are also beneficial for visual learners. Use visual note-taking, flashcards, perhaps posters, and highlighting key areas that they can see. And these are all quite easy to implement into the classroom. Let's now consider auditory learners. So auditory learners retain information from hearing. So how can we implement this into our classes? Discussion tasks, for example. Use music to help them retain information. Use listening tasks in different ways. You could use a TV clip, a film clip, or YouTube. Reading aloud can be really useful for auditory learners, and oral instructions from the teacher. You could also think about using podcasts or ebooks. Let's focus now on kinesthetic and tactile learners. So these learners retain information by doing, making, or active participation. So if we reflect on the classroom, this could be doing something, getting the students up out of their seat to do something. Role play. Get two students together to do some kind of role play with movement involved. Earlier, we looked at TPR, total physical response, and this was about movement and mime in the classroom. You could do note-taking activities or a running dictation. So what is a running dictation? This is where you put pictures or words around your classroom on walls and put your students into groups. One student from each group has to run to the wall, look, retain the information, and come back to the group and share. And on it goes. Games where they have to move around, mingling activities, or perhaps even tracing with your finger could be quite useful for tactile learners. So if you're learning how to write with younger learners, rather than using paper and pen, make it more interesting by using your finger. Also, miming and acting out are really useful for kinesthetic learners. Let's have a look at the key terms from the second part of Module 1. Deductive approach. So this is very much about the teacher explaining and then practicing. An inductive approach is more about guided discovery and letting the students explore. Grammar translation was how it started in 1840, very much about using translation, but very teacher-centred. We also looked at TPR, which is total physical response. Behaviourism. The humanistic approach, really focusing on the whole person, not just a cognitive level. The natural approach was about using language learning in the same way as how we acquire our native language, which leads on to language acquisition and how do students acquire language. Audiolingualism was very much about drilling. And then we had eclecticism, which is very much about a mixed method approach in the classroom to cater for the different learners. And if we look at visual learners, remember what we said. Perhaps they need to see something written on the board, or they need a picture to enhance their learning experience. Like in every module, it's always useful to do some consolidation and some further reading. For the second part of Module 1, I would recommend The Practice of English Language Teaching by Jeremy Harmer, and also Techniques and Principles in Language Teaching by Larson Freeman.